Between March and November of 1849, 17 male slaves disappeared from the household registries of Richmond's most prominent families. Official records show they were sold to distant plantations, yet shipping manifests contain no trace of these transfers. What the city's ledgers concealed was far more disturbing than simple accounting errors. In the parlors of Church Hill's grandest mansions, behind locked doors adorned with imported French wallpaper, 8 women from Virginia's oldest families had formed an arrangement so profane that its discovery would force the Virginia legislature to convene an emergency session. The men were never sold, they never left Richmond, and what these women did with them would remain Virginia's most closely guarded secret for over 7 decades. Before we continue with the story of Richmond's hidden society, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover the darkest corners of American history that others dare not explore. And in the comments below, tell us what state or city you are listening from. Now, let us descend into the perfumed darkness of Church Hill. The spring of 1849 found Richmond at the apex of its antebellum prosperity. The city's population had swelled to nearly 28,000 souls, its tobacco warehouses lining the James River like monuments to King Cotton's smaller, more aromatic cousin. Church Hill rose above the commercial district, a neighborhood of columned mansions where Virginia's oldest families maintained their town residences. These were not the nouveau riche of the cotton trade, but descendants of colonial gentry whose roots in Virginia soil preceded the Revolution. The women who gathered in these homes on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons presented themselves as paragons of Southern refinement. They organized charity drives for the poor, arranged flowers for St. John's Episcopal Church, and maintained the elaborate social rituals that separated Virginia aristocracy from mere wealth. Their husbands served in the state legislature, managed tobacco concerns, and practiced law. Their daughters learned French and piano. Their sons attended the College of William and Mary. Catherine Harrove presided over this social sphere with the quiet authority of old money. At 43, she had inherited the Harrove tobacco fortune upon her father's death, and managed it with an acumen that surprised Richmond's male business community. Her husband, Thomas Hargrove, served as a circuit court judge and spent much of his time traveling Virginia's western counties. The Hargrove Mansion on Franklin Street boasted 12 rooms, a music salon, and quarters for 23 enslaved people. Among Catherine's closest associates was Eleanor Randolph, a distant cousin of the president's family, whose husband owned controlling interest in 3 tobacco warehouses. Then there was Margaret Wickham, descended from one of Jamestown's founding families, who maintained 2 properties in Church Hill and a 1,000-acre plantation in Charles City County. Lucinda Epps had married into banking wealth, but possessed a pedigree that predated the marriage by 2 centuries. Her family tree intertwined with every notable Virginia family since 1650. These women understood power in ways their husbands did not fully grasp. While men wielded authority through law and commerce, Southern women of their class exercised control through more subtle means. They managed households containing dozens of enslaved people, adjudicated disputes, dispensed punishment, and made daily decisions affecting scores of lives. Within their domestic sphere, they were absolute monarchs, yet by early 1849, something had shifted in the careful balance of Church Hill society. Those who paid close attention might have noticed that Catherine Harrove's Tuesday afternoon salons had grown more exclusive. The guest list had narrowed from 20 women to 8. The servants who attended these gatherings were always the same and always male. The parlor doors remained locked during these meetings, unusual in an era when proper ladies kept doors open to preserve reputation. Richmond's black community noticed more. House servants whispered of strange requests, of men being summoned to mansions where they had no regular duties. Families in Shakobo Bottom spoke of husbands and sons who disappeared into Church Hill homes and returned changed silent, their eyes fixed on some middle distance as though afraid to meet a direct gaze. Samuel, a 31-year old man enslaved by the Harrow family, had served as Catherine's personal attendant since her father's death. He stood 6 feet tall, with the bearing of someone who had received better treatment than most enslaved people, having been taught to read despite Virginia law forbidding such education. He had been raised in the Harrow household, his mother serving as Catherine's childhood nurse. This proximity had created a relationship more complex than simple ownership, a dynamic that Catherine had begun to explore in ways that violated every boundary of her society. On a Tuesday afternoon in early March, Catherine summoned Samuel to her private sitting room, a space her husband rarely entered. What transpired in that room over the following hours would establish a pattern that would spread through Church Hill's elite homes like fever through a crowded tenement. The afternoon of March the 6th, 1849 began with unusual weather for early spring. A warm front had pushed up from the Carolinas, bringing temperatures into the low 70s and coating Richmond in humid air more typical of June. In the Harrow mansion, Catherine had dismissed all servants except Samuel, sending them on errands that would keep them occupied for hours. The window curtains were drawn despite the pleasant weather, and she had locked the door to her sitting room from the inside. What occurred in that room was never recorded in Catherine's meticulous journals, which documented every social call and household expense. But Samuel would later tell his wife, Dinah, who worked in the Randolph household, that Mrs. Hargrove had called him in under the pretense of moving furniture. Instead, she had asked him to sit, an instruction that violated every protocol of their relationship. She had poured him tea, another impossibility in the rigid hierarchy of a slave state. Then she had begun to speak of loneliness, of her husband's constant absences, of the peculiar isolation of a woman married to duty rather than companionship. Her words had started as confession but transformed into something more dangerous. She had touched his hand. She had asked him questions about his thoughts, his desires, treating him for those strange hours as something other than property. And then she had made a request that shattered the fundamental architecture of their world. Samuel left that room 3 hours later with instructions to tell no one, with a certain knowledge that resistance was impossible, and with the understanding that Tuesday afternoons would now follow this new unnatural pattern. Catherine emerged with a flush to her cheeks and a glitter in her eyes that her returning servants attributed to the unseasonable warmth. Within a week, Catherine had confided in Eleanor Randolph during a morning visit. The two women had been friends since childhood, their families allied through generations of marriages and business dealings. Whatever Catherine revealed in that conversation, Eleanor responded not with horror, but with curiosity. She asked questions, she made calculations, she wondered aloud whether her own household might accommodate similar arrangements. 2 weeks after Catherine's first transgression, Eleanor summoned Dinah's husband, Isaac, to her private chambers under the guise of repairing a loose window latch. The window required no repair. By April, 6 more women from Church Hill's innermost circle had adopted the practice. The women began meeting regularly, ostensibly for their charity work with the Richmond Female Orphan Asylum, but their conversations had taken on a different character. They spoke in coded language about their arrangements, comparing approaches, discussing logistics. Margaret Wickham revealed she had begun rotating between 3 different men from her household staff. Lucinda Epps confessed she preferred men in their late 20s, finding them more vigorous than older slaves, yet more disciplined than younger ones. What had begun as Catherine's private transgression evolved into something more organized, more systematic. The women developed protocols. They shared their enslaved men between households, creating a rotating schedule that spread the risk of discovery. If a servant was too frequently summoned to one mistress's private rooms, suspicions might arise. But if he was sent on errands between households, if his absences could be attributed to legitimate tasks, the pattern became harder to detect. By May of 1849, the 8 women had established what they called, with deliberate irony, the Sisterhood of Charity. The name served a dual purpose. It reflected their official cover story of charitable works, while mocking the very concept of Christian virtue they claimed to embody. They met every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, rotating between their various homes. The meetings began with actual charitable business, letters written to the orphan asylum or plans made for church social events, creating documentation of legitimate activity. But once this facade was established, the real purpose of their gatherings commenced. The women had developed a system of such elaborate secrecy that it would have impressed Richmond's military planners. Each woman kept 2 sets of household ledgers, one for her husband's inspection showing conventional expenses and activities, another hidden ledger tracking the true schedule of their arrangements. They employed trusted female house slaves as lookouts, positioning them at strategic points to watch for unexpected returns of husbands or surprise visitors. They developed hand signals and coded phrases. "We will need additional linen" meant a meeting was confirmed. "The roses require attention" indicated a cancellation due to risk. The men they summoned had no choice in their participation. Samuel, Isaac, and the others existed in a state of profound psychological torment. They were being used in ways that violated them as thoroughly as any violence, yet they could not resist without inviting punishment or sale. Some had wives, children, families who would suffer if they refused or revealed what was happening. They were trapped in a nightmare of their mistress's creation, forced to participate in their own exploitation while maintaining absolute silence. As spring surrendered to summer, the arrangement began to show cracks in its carefully constructed facade. The first sign came from an unexpected direction: the enslaved women of Church Hill. Dina had watched her husband transform over those months. Isaac had always been strong, proud despite his bondage, a man who maintained his dignity through small resistances and quiet refusals. But after Eleanor Randolph began summoning him to her private rooms, something inside him had shattered. He stopped meeting Dinah's eyes. He flinched when she touched him. At night, he lay rigid beside her, and she could hear his breathing catch, as though he were swallowing screams. She was not alone in noticing these changes. In the kitchens and laundry rooms of Church Hill, enslaved women gathered information like soldiers on reconnaissance. They compared notes about which men were being summoned, how often, under what pretenses. They noticed that these men were always the youngest, strongest, most handsome. They noticed their mistresses' flushed faces after these private meetings, the particular satisfaction in their expressions. The women understood what was happening long before any white person in Richmond suspected, and they faced an impossible choice: expose the abuse and risk their families being torn apart through sale and punishment, or remain silent and watch their husbands, brothers, and sons be used in ways that degraded everyone involved. Rachel, enslaved by Margaret Wickham, decided to act. She was 53 years old, had raised Margaret from infancy, and wielded the peculiar authority sometimes granted to enslaved women who had nursed their owners as babies. In early June, she confronted Margaret directly, choosing a moment when the two were alone in the breakfast room. "Miss Margaret," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the enormous risk she was taking, "I need to speak plain with you about what has been happening in this house." Margaret set down her teacup with deliberate care. "You forget yourself, Rachel." "No, ma'am. I am remembering myself, remembering that I raised you, that I have been loyal to this family for 37 years. And I am telling you that what you and those other ladies are doing, it is going to bring ruin down on all our heads." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Margaret's face had gone pale, then flushed deep red. When she finally spoke, her voice shook with fury and fear. "You will never speak of this again to anyone. Do you understand me? I understand that sin finds its way to light, no matter how deep you bury it." Rachel replied, "I understand that you cannot do this to these men without it corrupting everything it touches." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Get out. And if you value your daughter's safety, you will never mention this subject again." The threat was explicit. Rachel's daughter, just 14 years old, worked in the Wickham kitchen. Margaret was reminding Rachel of how easily that daughter could be sold south, sent to the cotton fields where life expectancy rarely exceeded 10 years. Rachel left the breakfast room with her head high. But Margaret's warning accomplished its purpose. Rachel would not speak of it again, at least not to anyone white. But she did speak to the other women, and together they began to strategize. If they could not stop the abuse directly, perhaps they could create enough disruption to make it too dangerous to continue. Small acts of sabotage began to plague the 8 households. Linens disappeared. Meals were oversalted. Messages went undelivered. Nothing so dramatic as to warrant severe punishment, but enough to create friction to make the smooth operation of these households less reliable. The sisterhood noticed, but misinterpreted these disruptions. They believed their enslaved workers were simply becoming lazy, growing too comfortable in their positions. This interpretation led them to increased discipline, which only deepened the resentment and expanded the careful campaign of resistance. By July, a different threat had emerged from an unexpected direction. Thomas Hargrove, Catherine's husband, had returned early from his circuit court travels due to a case being postponed. He arrived home on a Tuesday afternoon, precisely when Catherine's salon was in session. The front door was locked from inside, highly unusual for a social gathering. He could hear women's voices in the parlor, but also something else, sounds that did not align with charitable committee work. Thomas entered through the kitchen entrance, startling the servants, who had been given strict instructions to admit no one during these meetings. Before they could warn their mistress, he had walked through the house and reached the parlor door. It was locked. From inside came the murmur of female conversation punctuated by something else, a deeper voice, definitely male. "Catherine," he called, knocking firmly. "Open this door." The conversation stopped abruptly. There followed perhaps 30 seconds of silence, then footsteps, the sound of the key turning. Catherine opened the door with her face composed in perfect calm, though Thomas noticed a slight disarray to her hair and a brightness to her eyes that suggested agitation. "Thomas, you are home early. How unexpected." Her tone was light, but he caught the edge of anxiety beneath it. He looked past her into the parlor. 5 other women were present, all from the highest echelons of Richmond society, and standing by the window, looking distinctly uncomfortable, was Samuel. There was no apparent reason for a male slave to be present during a ladies' charitable meeting. "What is he doing here?" Thomas asked, his gaze fixed on Samuel. "He was moving a desk for us," Catherine replied smoothly. "The afternoon light had shifted and we needed to rearrange the furniture. Samuel was just leaving." It was a plausible explanation, yet something about the scene troubled Thomas. The women's faces showed not the relaxed comfort of social visiting, but a tension he could not quite identify. Samuel's expression was carefully blank, but his posture suggested shame rather than the neutral demeanor expected from a servant completing a simple task. Thomas let it pass with a nod, but over the following days he found himself watching his wife more carefully. He noticed patterns he had previously overlooked: the locked doors, the specific servants present during her salons, her insistence on absolute privacy during these gatherings. He said nothing, but his attention had been awakened, and once awakened, it would prove difficult to deceive. The summer heat had descended on Richmond with oppressive weight by late July, turning the city into a slow cooking pot of humidity and tension. The 8 women of the sisterhood grew bolder even as warning signs multiplied around them. Perhaps it was the intoxication of transgression, the addictive quality of violating every rule that had governed their lives since birth. Perhaps it was simply that they had gone too long without consequences and had begun to believe themselves untouchable. Catherine had added 2 more men to her rotation by August, both from her country property, whom she had transferred to Richmond under the pretext of needing additional household staff. She had also begun hosting evening gatherings in addition to the afternoon salons, small dinners where the wine flowed freely, and the conversation turned increasingly frank about their arrangements. The women had begun to treat their systematic exploitation as an open secret among themselves. discussing it with the casual matter-of-factness that other ladies might use when talking about new dress patterns or the quality of their gardens. Eleanor Randolph had begun documenting their activities in a coded journal using a cipher she had learned from her father. Each man was assigned a number, each woman a letter. Encounters were recorded with dates and brief notes about satisfaction level. She kept this journal in a locked drawer of her writing desk, convinced that the code made its contents impenetrable to anyone who might discover it. What Eleanor did not know was that Isaac, the man she summoned most frequently, could read. He had been taught by Elena's father years before, during a period when some slaveholders still believed education might make their human property more valuable. Isaac had seen Elena working in her journal, had noticed where she kept the key. Late one night in August, while Elena and her husband slept, Isaac had carefully picked the desk lock, using a wire from a broken corset stay. He could not immediately break the cipher, but he carefully copied several pages onto paper he had stolen from the kitchen accounts ledger. He hid these copies in the cellar, wrapped in oilcloth and buried beneath a loose stone. He was not certain what he would do with this evidence, but he understood instinctively that documentation was power, even for someone who had no legal standing to possess power. Isaac shared his discovery with Samuel, and together they began to conceive of something unprecedented, a way to expose their mistresses that might not result in their own destruction. They needed an ally, someone white, who possessed both the authority to act and the moral courage to do so. They found him in an unexpected place. Reverend William Thompson had served at St. John's Episcopal Church for 11 years. At 62, he was respected but not beloved, known for sermons that emphasized duty and judgment rather than comfort and grace. He was also unusually vocal in his belief that slavery, while perhaps necessary, was not inherently virtuous and carried moral responsibilities that most slaveholders shirked. This position had not made him popular with Church Hill's elite, but his social standing and education protected him from direct criticism. Samuel's mother, Celia, worked in the church as a cleaner. She had known Reverend Thompson since his arrival in Richmond and had occasionally spoken with him about matters of faith and morality. In late August, Samuel asked his mother to arrange a private meeting with the Reverend, claiming he needed spiritual counsel regarding a matter of conscience. The meeting took place in the church's small library on an evening when no services were scheduled. Samuel had never been so frightened in his life. He was about to accuse some of Richmond's most powerful women of profound moral transgression. If Thompson did not believe him, or worse, if Thompson believed him but chose to protect the women rather than pursue justice, Samuel would likely be sold south before the week ended. But Samuel had judged his man correctly as he described what was happening, choosing his words carefully to convey the abuse without explicit detail. He watched Thompson's face transform from skepticism to horror to cold fury. When Samuel finished speaking, the Reverend sat in silence for several minutes, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "These are serious accusations," Thompson finally said. "I am aware, but there is documentation, sir, written evidence kept by Mrs. Randolph, and there are witnesses if they could be convinced to speak. Every enslaved person in those 8 households knows what has been happening." Thompson stood and paced to the window, looking out at Church Hill's mansions silhouetted against the evening sky. "Do you understand what you're asking me to do? To accuse these women would be to shake Richmond society to its foundations. I would be challenging some of the most powerful families in Virginia. I understand, sir. I also understand that what they are doing is evil, and that evil thrives when good men choose comfort over truth." The Reverend turned back to face Samuel, and in his eyes was the glint of something fierce and uncompromising. "I will need the written evidence. Can you obtain it without being caught?" "Yes, sir. I believe I can." "Then do so. Bring it to me here in 3 days." And Samuel Thompson paused. "I want you to know that I believe you and I will act on this regardless of the personal cost. Some sins are too profound to overlook." The next 3 days passed in exquisite tension. Isaac and Samuel waited for an evening when the Randolph household was hosting a dinner party, when Elelena would be occupied for hours and unable to check her private chambers. On the evening of September 1st, as guests arrived and servants rushed through their duties, Isaac slipped upstairs. His hands shook as he picked the desk lock again. The journal was exactly where Elelena kept it. He removed it carefully, wrapping it in a kitchen towel he had brought for this purpose. He placed a book of similar size and weight in the drawer, so that if Elelena checked, she would feel the expected resistance and weight when she opened it. Then he descended the servants' stairs and handed the journal to Samuel, who was waiting in the garden. Samuel ran through the evening streets to St. John's Church. Reverend Thompson was waiting in the library, and together they sat under lamplight and began to decode Eleanor's cipher. It was simpler than Eleanor had imagined, a basic substitution code that yielded to patient analysis. Within 2 hours, they had translated enough pages to confirm everything Samuel had described. The journal entries were explicit and damning. Eleanor had recorded names, dates, and details with the meticulous care of someone who had no fear of discovery. She had even assigned ratings, numerical scores for each man's performance. Reading these pages, Thompson's face grew increasingly rigid with disgust. "This is enough," he said finally, "more than enough. I will take this to Bishop Me tomorrow. He will have to convene a church inquiry, and from there this will reach the civil authorities." "And what will happen to us?" Samuel asked. "To the men who were used this way?" Thompson looked at him with genuine sorrow. "I do not know. I wish I could promise you protection, but the truth is that Virginia law sees you as property, not victims. The women will face social ruin and possibly criminal charges, but you will face the consequences of your master's choices. It is profoundly unjust, but it is the world we live in. We know the risks, sir, but this has to end. Not just for us, but for anyone else who might suffer this way in the future." Thompson nodded slowly. "Return the journal to where you found it. Let them have no warning of what is coming. Can you do that without being caught?" "I can try, sir." Samuel ran back to the house where the dinner party was still in progress. He returned the journal to Isaac, who had been waiting in growing panic. Isaac ascended the stairs again, replaced the journal in the desk, and relocked the drawer. The whole theft had lasted less than 3 hours, and as far as anyone in the household knew, nothing unusual had occurred. But the next morning, Reverend Thompson traveled to the home of Bishop William Meade, the Episcopal Bishop of Virginia, and one of the most influential religious figures in the state. Thompson brought with him detailed notes from Eleanor's journal, including specific dates, names, and descriptions that could not be dismissed as slander or confusion. Bishop Mee had served as bishop for 18 years. He was 73 years old, stern in manner, and deeply conservative in his social views. He believed slavery was ordained by God as a means of bringing Christian civilization to an inferior race, a view shared by most white Virginians of his class. But he also believed that with ownership came heavy moral responsibility, and that slaveholders who abused their position would answer to divine judgment. As Thompson laid out the evidence, Bishop Mee's expression moved through stages of disbelief, shock, and fury. When Thompson finished, the bishop sat in silence for several minutes, his age suddenly visible in the sag of his shoulders and the heaviness of his breathing. "If this is true," he said finally, "it represents a moral corruption so profound that I can scarcely comprehend it. These are women I have known for decades, women who sit in my church every Sunday and profess Christian virtue. It is true, Your Grace. I have seen the written evidence. I have spoken to witnesses that we have no choice but to act. But William, do you understand what this will unleash? This is not simply a matter of individual sin. This will expose rot at the heart of Richmond's social order. It will suggest that the very women we trust to uphold moral standards, to raise children, and manage households are capable of profound evil. I understand, but the alternative is to allow this to continue, to become complicit through our silence. Bishop Mee stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the morning light on Richmond streets. Convene a private inquiry. Select 5 men of unimpeachable character, men with no family ties to the accused women. I will preside over the proceedings myself. We will hear the evidence, interview the witnesses, and determine the truth of this matter. If these accusations prove accurate, we will turn our findings over to the civil authorities. May God have mercy on us all. The inquiry was convened in absolute secrecy on September 10th in a private room at St. John's Church. The 5 men Bishop Meade selected were all respected community leaders, but none from Church Hill's innermost circle. They included a merchant, a physician, a lawyer, a plantation owner from Henrio County, and a professor from Hampton-Sydney College. All had been sworn to confidentiality and understood they were investigating matters of extraordinary sensitivity. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the horror in Richmond intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and do not forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let us discover together what happens next. The inquiry began with Reverend Thompson presenting his evidence and explaining how it had come to his attention. The panel members listened in growing shock as he described the system the 8 women had established. Then he presented his transcriptions from Elelena's journal, reading selected passages aloud. The explicit nature of the entries left no doubt about what had occurred. Next came the witnesses. Samuel testified first, describing in careful, restrained language what Catherine Harrow had subjected him to. His dignity in the face of such violation moved several panel members to visible emotion. Isaac followed, corroborating Samuel's testimony and adding details about Elena Randolph's behavior. 3 more enslaved men testified, each describing similar patterns of coercion and abuse. Then came Rachel, Margaret Wickham's enslaved nurse. She testified about confronting Margaret and about the threat Margaret had made against Rachel's daughter. Her testimony established that at least some of the women had been consciously aware their actions were wrong and had been actively working to conceal them. The final witness was unexpected. Dr. Henry Garrett, a Richmond physician who attended several of Church Hill's elite families, he testified that he had been called to examine Elena Randolph in July after she complained of female troubles. His examination had revealed evidence consistent with frequent sexual activity, surprising in a woman whose husband had been traveling for business during the previous month. At the time he had noted this oddity, but had not spoken of it, assuming perhaps an affair with someone of her own class. Now, in light of the other testimony, the significance of his findings became clear. The inquiry concluded late that evening. The panel deliberated for less than an hour before reaching their verdict. The accusations were credible and supported by substantial evidence. Bishop Mee directed that a formal report be prepared and delivered to the governor of Virginia, along with a recommendation that criminal charges be filed against all 8 women. The next morning, September 11th, Bishop Meade personally delivered the inquiry's findings to Governor John Floyd at the state capitol. Floyd read the report in silence, his face growing increasingly flushed. When he finished, he looked up at the bishop with something close to despair in his eyes. "Do you understand what you are handing me? If this becomes public, it will destroy some of Virginia's most prominent families. It will suggest that our entire social order is built on hypocrisy and perversion. I understand completely, Governor. I also understand that justice demands action regardless of the social consequences." Floyd stood and walked to his window, echoing Bishop Mee's earlier gesture at his own home. Outside, Richmond conducted its ordinary business, unaware that its foundations were about to shift. "I will have to involve the state legislature. This is too large for executive action alone. We will need to convene an emergency session. When? Give me 3 days to prepare the ground. Some of the legislators are friends or relations of the accused women. I need to speak with key members privately before this goes to the full assembly. And the women, should they be arrested?" Floyd shook his head slowly. "Not yet. If we arrest them now before the legislature has determined how to proceed, we risk legal challenges that might compromise the entire case, but I will have them placed under discreet surveillance. If any attempt to flee Richmond, we will detain them immediately." That same afternoon, Floyd summoned his most trusted aide, a lawyer named Robert Stannard. who had served 3 governors and possessed both discretion and moral clarity. Floyd handed him the inquiry report and watched as Stannard read through it, his expression shifting from curiosity to revulsion. "Dear God," Stannard whispered when he finished, "how long has this been occurring?" "Since March, as far as we can determine, possibly longer in some cases. I need you to conduct preliminary legal research. What charges can we bring under Virginia law? What precedents exist? And most importantly, how do we proceed without creating a public spectacle that damages Virginia's reputation throughout the nation?" Stannard spent the next 2 days in the state law library, poring over statutes and case records. What he discovered was both encouraging and problematic. Virginia law clearly prohibited adultery and fornication with penalties that included public whipping and fines. Several 18th century cases had resulted in convictions of white women for sexual relations with enslaved men, though these typically involved poor women without social standing. But nowhere in Virginia's legal history could Stannard find a case remotely similar to this one. Wealthy, socially prominent women systematically exploiting multiple enslaved men over an extended period. The closest parallel was a 1762 case from Williamsburg involving a tavern keeper's wife. But that woman had been quickly convicted and whipped in the public square. Applying the same punishment to women from Virginia's oldest families seemed both legally appropriate and politically impossible. Stannard reported his findings to Floyd on the evening of September 13th. "The law is clear on the criminality of their actions," he explained, "but enforcing that law in this case presents extraordinary challenges. These women have powerful family connections throughout Virginia. Several legislators are their cousins or brothers-in-law. If we pursue standard legal proceedings, we'll face challenges at every stage. What do you recommend? An extraordinary measure? Convene the legislature in emergency session. Present them with the evidence and let them determine how to proceed. This removes the decision from your office and spreads the responsibility across the entire General Assembly. Whatever they decide will carry the weight of collective judgment rather than executive fiat." Floyd nodded slowly. "And if they choose to protect these women, if family loyalty outweighs justice, then we will have learned something terrible about Virginia's moral character. But I don't believe that will happen. The evidence is too damning, and the men who sit in that chamber still believe, however imperfectly, in principles of honor and law." Over the next 2 days, Governor Floyd conducted a series of private meetings with legislative leaders. He met first with Speaker of the House James Barber, a man known for uncompromising integrity despite his own slaveholding interests. Barber read the inquiry report in Floyd's office, his face darkening with each page. "This is an abomination," Barber said when he finished. "These women have violated every principle of Christian civilization. They have degraded themselves, corrupted their households, and brought shame upon Virginia. Will you support an emergency session?" "I will, and I will support whatever punishment the Assembly deems appropriate regardless of who these women's families are." Floyd met next with key senators, with committee chairmen, with the leaders of various legislative factions. The response was universally shocked, though some expressed more concern about scandal than about justice. Senator William Rives, whose wife was distantly related to Eleanor Randolph, argued vehemently for handling the matter quietly, perhaps through civil proceedings that would avoid public exposure. "If this becomes known," Rives insisted, "it will provide ammunition for every abolitionist newspaper in the North. They will use this to argue that slavery corrupts everyone it touches, that Southern society is morally bankrupt. We must consider Virginia's reputation." Floyd's response was sharp. "Virginia's reputation is not built on concealing evil, Senator. It is built on addressing evil when we discover it. Would you have us protect these women simply because their exposure might prove inconvenient?" By the evening of September 13th, Floyd had secured enough support to convene the emergency session. He drafted the official summons, citing matters of urgent moral and legal concern requiring immediate legislative attention. The session would convene the following morning at 9:00, and attendance was mandatory for all members of both houses. Meanwhile, in Church Hill, the 8 women had begun to sense that something was terribly wrong. Catherine Hargrove noticed strange men watching her house, men who made no effort to approach, but who seemed to be documenting everyone who entered or left. When she sent Samuel to inquire at the market about household supplies, he returned with news that similar men were positioned near the other women's homes. Catherine immediately called an emergency meeting of the Sisterhood, sending coded messages through her most trusted servants. The women gathered at Margaret Wickham's house that evening, their usual confidence replaced by nervous energy. "We're being watched," Catherine announced without preamble. "All of us. Someone knows." Eleanor Randolph went pale. "That's impossible. We've been so careful. No one outside our group knows about our arrangement. Someone knows. The question is who and what they plan to do with that knowledge." Lucinda Epps stood abruptly, her hands trembling. "We should leave Richmond tonight before whatever is coming actually arrives." "And go where?" Margaret demanded. "If we flee, we confirm guilt. We must stay and present a united front. Whatever accusations are made, we deny them absolutely. It's our word against the word of slaves, and Virginia law is clear about whose testimony matters." Catherine was not so sure. Virginia law is also clear about adultery. If someone has actual evidence, not just testimony, our social standing may not protect us. "What evidence could they possibly have?" Elena asked. "We've left no written records, no documentation of any kind." Even as she said it, she felt a cold sensation in her stomach, a sudden doubt about the security of her coded journal. The women debated through the evening, but they reached no consensus. Some wanted to flee, others to stay and fight, still others to seek help from their powerful family connections. They parted near midnight with a plan to reconvene the following day, unaware that by then their fates would already be sealed. On September 14th, the emergency legislative session convened behind closed doors. Only members of the General Assembly were permitted to attend, no press or public observers. Governor Floyd took his position at the front of the chamber and waited for silence. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of profound regret. "Gentlemen, I have called you here today to address a matter of such grave moral import that I can scarcely find words adequate to its description. What I am about to present will shock you. It will offend your sensibilities and challenge your understanding of the society we have built here in Virginia. But I ask you to listen with open minds and to remember that justice, however painful, must be our guiding principle." He then presented the inquiry report, reading selected portions aloud and distributing copies to key legislators. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the full scope of the scandal became clear. When Floyd finished, he opened the floor for questions and debate. Senator Thomas Ritchie, a man of 72 years who had known some of the accused women since their childhoods, rose first. His voice shook with emotion. "Governor Floyd, these are daughters of Virginia's most respected families, women I have known personally for decades. Are we absolutely certain of these accusations? The evidence is overwhelming, Senator. Written documentation, multiple witness testimonies, even medical evidence." The inquiry panel consisted of 5 men of unimpeachable character who reviewed everything carefully. Their conclusion was unanimous. Delegate John Minor rose next. "What of the enslaved men who testified? How do we know they are telling the truth? Might they have motivations to slander their mistresses?" Floyd had anticipated this question. What possible motivation would they have? Coming forward exposed them to enormous risk. They faced potential sale, separation from their families, or worse. They gained nothing from this testimony except the possibility that the abuse might end. The debate continued for hours, growing increasingly heated. Men stood and condemned the women in language of biblical fury. Others defended them, arguing that the real villains were the enslaved men who had somehow seduced their mistresses. Several legislators with direct family connections to the accused women recused themselves from the proceedings, their faces gray with shame and fury. Delegate Samuel McDowell delivered perhaps the most powerful speech of the session. He was a younger man, only 34, known for his legal acumen and moral seriousness. He rose near the middle of the debate and spoke without notes, his voice clear and firm. "Gentlemen, I understand the impulse to protect these women. They are our neighbors, our family members, women we have been raised to view as paragons of virtue. But that is precisely why this matter is so serious. These women did not simply commit adultery. They systematically exploited human beings over whom they held absolute power. They used the institution of slavery itself as a mechanism for their own gratification, violating both the laws of God and the laws of Virginia. Some here have suggested that the enslaved men somehow seduced these women. I would ask those colleagues to consider the nature of power in these relationships. How does a man who can be whipped or sold for disobedience seduce the woman who holds his fate in her hands? This was not seduction. This was coercion, pure and simple, and the women wielded that coercion. We are often told that slavery is a civilizing institution, that it brings Christianity in order to an inferior race. How can we maintain that argument while simultaneously arguing that enslaved men corrupted their pure white mistresses? Either these men are inferior and incapable of such corruption, or they are equal to us in their capacity for moral agency. We cannot have it both ways. I propose that we face this matter with the honesty it demands. These women committed grave crimes. They violated their marriage vows. They corrupted their households, and they brought disgrace upon Virginia. The law provides remedies for such crimes, and we must apply those remedies regardless of the social status of the offenders. To do otherwise is to admit that we have one law for the powerful and another for everyone else. McDowell's speech shifted the tenor of the debate. Several legislators who had been wavering now spoke in favor of prosecution, but the question remained, what form should that prosecution take? The Assembly debated various options through the afternoon and into the evening. Criminal prosecution under adultery statutes would require public trials, which would inevitably become spectacles covered by newspapers throughout the nation. Some legislators argued this was necessary, that justice required full transparency. Others insisted it would damage Virginia's reputation irreparably and provide propaganda for abolitionists. A third option emerged during the evening session proposed by Senator Benjamin Watkins Lee. What if we offer them exile, remove them from Virginia permanently, confiscate their property to their husbands, but spare them public trial and punishment? This achieves justice while limiting the scandal. The proposal sparked immediate debate. Some saw it as too lenient, allowing wealthy women to escape consequences that poor women would face without question. Others saw it as appropriately balanced, punishing the women severely while protecting Virginia from national humiliation. Delegate McDowell rose again. I understand the appeal of this compromise, but I must ask, are we creating precedent that the wealthy can buy their way out of criminal prosecution? What message does that send? Senator Lee responded thoughtfully. We are not allowing them to buy anything. We are forfeiting their property and banishing them from their homeland forever. For women of their class, that is a punishment, perhaps more severe than a public whipping. They lose everything: their homes, their families, their social positions, their very identities as Virginians, and Virginia is spared the spectacle of putting its most prominent women on trial for sexual crimes. The debate continued past midnight, finally reaching a vote near 1:00 in the morning on September 15th. The measure passed by a narrow margin. The women would be charged under Virginia's adultery statutes, but offered the option of permanent exile in lieu of criminal trial. If they accepted exile, they would forfeit all property. Their husbands agree never to return to Virginia under penalty of imprisonment, and accept strict non-disclosure agreements forbidding them from speaking publicly about the case. A second vote addressed the enslaved men who had testified. After lengthy debate, the Assembly voted to purchase them from their owners at fair market value and grant them conditional freedom. They would be required to leave Virginia within 30 days and would face re-enslavement if they ever returned. It was an imperfect solution, one that acknowledged the men as victims while simultaneously treating them as threats to social order that needed to be removed from Virginia. The final vote concerned the records themselves, the inquiry report, the legislative debate transcripts, and all related documents would be sealed in the state archives for 75 years, not to be opened before 1924. This provision passed with overwhelming support, as even legislators who had pushed for harsher punishment recognized the value of limiting public knowledge of the scandal. On September 15th, before dawn, officials arrived at the 8 homes to inform the women of the charges against them and the terms of their exile. State deputies, accompanied by lawyers and witnessed by notaries, delivered formal documents detailing their options: accept immediate exile and property forfeit, or face criminal prosecution in open court. Catherine Harrove received her notice at 5:30 in the morning. She read it carefully, face betraying no emotion, while Thomas stood nearby with his own lawyer. When she finished, she looked up at her husband of 19 years. "You knew," she said. "It was not a question. I suspected. I chose not to see clearly until I could no longer avoid it. Will you divorce me? I have already filed the papers. They will be finalized within the month." Catherine nodded slowly. "I suppose I should feel shame. I find I do not. I feel only anger that I lived in a cage so long without recognizing it for what it was." "You violated everything we claim to hold sacred," Thomas replied, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You took men who had no choice, no power to refuse you, and you used them for your own gratification. Do not dress that up as some kind of rebellion against injustice. And yet you see no injustice in the system that gave me absolute power over them in the first place. You see no problem with a society that treats human beings as property, but then expresses shock when that property is used in ways you find distasteful." Thomas had no answer for that. He turned and left the room, and Catherine began the process of packing her belongings. She had 24 hours to prepare for permanent exile from the only home she had ever known. Eleanor Randolph's response was far more dramatic. When the officials arrived at her home, she collapsed completely, sobbing uncontrollably and claiming that she had been led astray by Catherine's evil influence. Her husband remarkably stood by her side throughout her breakdown, his face set in an expression of grim determination. "She is my wife," he told the officials. "Whatever she has done, she is still my wife. If she must leave Virginia, I will go with her. Our marriage vows did not include exceptions for scandal or disgrace." The officials seemed unsure how to respond to this unexpected loyalty. They explained that he was under no legal obligation to accompany her, that he could divorce her and retain all property and social standing. But he shook his head firmly. "I made promises before God. I will keep them." Margaret Wickham became furiously indignant, insisting that as a white woman of impeccable lineage, she could not possibly be guilty of such charges. "This is a conspiracy by Northern abolitionists," she declared to the Buste officials. "They have coerced our slaves into giving false testimony to damage Virginia's reputation. I will not dignify these accusations by accepting their terms." "Then you will face trial, Mrs. Wickham," the lead official replied calmly. "The evidence against you is substantial. I would strongly advise accepting exile." Margaret's defiance lasted approximately 2 hours until her family lawyer arrived and explained in stark terms what a public trial would entail. The testimony would be explicit and damning. Her family name would be dragged through every newspaper in America. Her children and grandchildren would bear the stain of her scandal. By noon, she had signed the documents accepting exile. Lucinda Epps simply went silent, retreating into a catatonic state from which her family could not rouse her. A physician was called who diagnosed a complete nervous collapse. She would eventually recover enough to travel, but would never speak coherently about the events of September 1849. Her husband divorced her quietly, and she was sent to live with distant relatives in Pennsylvania, who agreed to take her on condition that she never be left alone with male servants. Over the following week, the 8 women departed Richmond at various times and by various routes. Catherine Harrove left first on the evening of September 16th. She traveled by hired carriage to Norfolk, where she boarded a steamship to New Orleans. She carried 2 trunks of clothing, a small box of jewelry that was legally her own rather than her husband's, and $300 in cash. Everything else she had owned now belonged to Thomas. As her carriage rolled through Richmond's darkened streets, she looked back once at the city of her birth. Church Hill's mansions were silhouetted against the night sky, their windows lit with lamplight, families gathering for evening meals in rooms where she would never be welcome again. She felt no tears, no regret, only a cold clarity about what her life had been and what it might become. Eleanor Randolph and her loyal husband departed 3 days later, traveling north to Philadelphia. Before leaving, Eleanor asked to see Isaac one final time. The officials denied this request, explaining that she was forbidden from any contact with the men who had been involved. She wept at this denial, crying that she wanted to apologize to explain that she had never meant to hurt anyone. Her husband gently but firmly led her to their carriage. Margaret Wickham left for Baltimore with her eldest daughter, who had volunteered to accompany her into exile, despite the damage it might do to her own marriage prospects. The other women departed in similar fashion, some alone, some with family members who chose loyalty over reputation. By September 23rd, all 8 had left Virginia, and Church Hill Society began the painful process of erasing them from its collective memory. Meanwhile, Samuel, Isaac, and the other men who had testified received their papers of conditional freedom on September 20th. The document was brief, printed on official state stationery, and signed by Governor Floyd himself. It stated simply that they had been manumitted by the Commonwealth of Virginia as compensation for their testimony in a matter of state importance, and that they were required to depart Virginia by October 20th. Samuel read his papers 3 times, unable to quite believe what they represented. Freedom. It was a word he had heard all his life, but never expected to experience. But it was freedom with sharp limitations. He could never return to Virginia, could never see his mother's grave once she died, could never walk the streets of the only city he had ever known. He gathered his wife and mother and explained what had happened, showing them the papers with hands that shook slightly. His mother, Celia, wept silently. She was 61 years old and had been enslaved for her entire life. The idea of freedom at her age was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Where will we go?" his wife asked. "North Philadelphia, maybe somewhere with a large community of free black people where we might find work and build a life." "And what do we tell people? How do we explain how we got free?" Samuel looked at his freedom papers again. "We tell them the truth, that we testified in a legal matter and Virginia chose to free us. We don't need to explain what we testified about." Before leaving Richmond, Samuel returned to St. John's Church one final time. He found Reverend Thompson in the small library where they had first met, where Samuel had taken the enormous risk of accusing some of Richmond's most powerful women. "I came to thank you, sir," Samuel said, "for believing me, for acting when you could have chosen to look away." Thompson stood and gripped Samuel's hand tightly. "I am sorry I could not do more. I am sorry Virginia's laws could not offer you real justice, only this half measure of freedom with exile attached. It's more than I had any right to expect. It's more than most enslaved people will ever see. You gave me something I never thought I would have. What will you do in Philadelphia? Find work, build a life, try to forget what happened in that house on Franklin Street?" Thompson nodded slowly. "I hope you can forget. But I also hope that someday, when slavery is finally ended, people will remember what you endured, not for vengeance, but for understanding, so that future generations might grasp how completely this system corrupted everyone it touched." Samuel left Richmond on October 3rd, traveling by hired wagon with his wife and mother. They reached Philadelphia 11 days later, arriving with almost no money and no connections in the city. But Samuel was skilled as a carpenter, and he found work within a week. He rented a small house in the district where free black people were concentrated, and slowly, painfully, he began to build a new life. He never spoke publicly about what had happened to him in Richmond, but he did write it down. In a journal he kept hidden in his workshop. He documented everything. Catherine Hargrove's first summons, the systematic abuse that followed, the growing horror as he realized other men were experiencing the same exploitation, the terrifying decision to approach Reverend Thompson, the inquiry, the legislative session he had not been allowed to attend, and finally the freedom papers that had sent him into exile. Isaac went to New York, settling in the growing black community in Lower Manhattan. Unlike Samuel, he did speak about his experience, though never using his real name or identifying the women specifically. He became involved in the abolitionist movement, attending meetings and occasionally giving testimony about the realities of slavery. His accounts of being exploited by his mistress provided powerful ammunition for abolitionist arguments that slavery corrupted everyone it touched, white and black alike. At an anti-slavery meeting in 1853, Isaac spoke to a crowd of nearly 200 people. "They tell you that slavery is a civilizing institution," he said, his voice carrying across the packed hall. "They tell you that it benefits both master and slave, that it brings Christianity and order to an inferior race. But I can tell you from my own experience that slavery is nothing but corruption. It corrupts the enslaved by stripping them of autonomy and dignity, and it corrupts the enslaver by giving them absolute power over other human beings, absolute power without check or balance, without accountability or restraint, and that power will be abused. It cannot be otherwise. The other men scattered across the North, some to Philadelphia, others to New York, Boston, or even Canada. A few tried to build normal lives, finding work and starting families and trying to forget Richmond. Others could not escape the memories and lived haunted lives broken by what had been done to them. Back in Richmond, the scandal's echoes continued to reverberate through Church Hill society despite official silence. The 8 families whose women had been exiled found themselves socially isolated, invited to fewer gatherings, excluded from committees and boards where they had once been central figures. Some of the families left Richmond entirely, moving to other cities where their names carried less baggage. The enslaved people who had witnessed the scandal but had not testified lived in a strange limbo. They knew what had happened, had seen things that violated every stated principle of the society they lived in, but they were forbidden from speaking about it. The knowledge sat inside them like poison, creating a shared understanding among Richmond's black community that the white families they served were capable of profound hypocrisy. Rachel, Margaret Wickham's former nurse, chose to remain in Richmond despite her newfound freedom. At 73, she was too old to start over. In a new place, too tired to begin again, she lived with her daughter in a small house in Showbottom, surviving on the small amount of money Margaret had been allowed to give her before leaving Virginia. In her final years, Rachel would sometimes sit on her porch in the evenings and look up toward Church Hill, toward the mansions where she had spent her life serving people who claimed moral superiority while practicing profound evil. She never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed, but she made certain her daughter and granddaughters knew the truth. "Don't ever let them tell you they're better than us," she would say. "Don't ever believe that white skin or fine houses make people good. I've seen what they really are when nobody's watching." She died in 1860, just months before the Civil War would begin to tear apart the society she had known. She was buried in Richmond's Africanemean Cemetery, her grave marked with a simple stone that gave her name and dates, but no hint of the role she had played in exposing Church Hill's darkest secret. The official records of the incident remained sealed in the Virginia State Archives, exactly as the legislature had mandated. Vault that contained them was opened periodically for routine maintenance, but the documents inside remained untouched. Even the archivists who maintained the collection did not know what the sealed files contained, only that they were not to be opened before 1924. Richmond society absorbed the scandal as best it could, creating a sanitized narrative that preserved reputations while obscuring truth. The official story was that 8 women from prominent families had been involved in financial improprieties and had chosen exile to avoid prosecution for embezzlement. This version was repeated so often that many people came to believe it, preferring a tale of white-collar crime to the reality of what had actually occurred. But truth has a way of persisting even when officially suppressed. In the kitchens and laundry rooms, in the quarters where enslaved people lived, the real story circulated. It was told in whispers passed down through generations, modified and embellished until it took on an almost mythical quality. Some versions claimed there had been 20 women involved, others that the women had been practicing some form of witchcraft or devil worship. But at the core of every version was the essential truth. Richmond's most respectable ladies had systematically exploited their male slaves in ways that violated every stated principle of Southern civilization.